Hello and welcome to the Happy PharmD podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Alex Barker, and today we're talking about ageism. So, you probably have heard people talking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as a subsect of this topic is the idea of ageism, being biased against one's age. And for this, I invited Dr. Rose Judy to come on the podcast. Dr. Rose is a PhD psychologist. She's someone who's been working in this field for quite some time. And so I wanted to share her expertise, her knowledge on the subject, and some of the work that she has been doing in this area. If you've ever thought, I'm too young, or I'm too old, or I don't have enough experience, I have too much experience, I think this is a conversation for you and to learn a little bit more about what's going on in the workplace and maybe how to begin to try to attempt to fix the problem. Thanks for joining us today in the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
What is your background and how did you stumble into this expertise? And how did you attract me to want to reach out to you? Because what I find that you do is so fascinating in today's world.
I stumbled across it not by choice, actually.
Hmm.
And I think people who have heard me talk about this in the past will probably know some of that story and background. But um, I experienced it in a personal, and by it, I mean, discrimination, ageism. I experienced it kind of in almost an intimate personal circle when my parents and us as kids immigrated to a country that differed linguistically and culturally to our background, which I'm from the Middle East. I was born in Iraq and Baghdad, but my dad, who I consider a role model and someone who I aspired to be like, in his openness and his enthusiasm for science and dedication to students as an academic, um, I it was an experience that we encountered when my dad would apply for jobs, having an ethnic name and a bit of a thick English accent because of the dialect, etc., and the language. And he was receiving rejection letters, and it made me realize how this was the first time that in my eyes, someone who I felt was very qualified to do something, in the eyes of other people, they were still not good enough, right? There was something about them that, and this is my dad, who I thought, what is not good enough about what he has to offer? But it was in one of the interviews that he was actually, and this was back in the 90s. So it was one of the interviews where he was actually kind of told informally that he was too old for the position because the engineering company was predominantly made up of younger people and he was overqualified, right? And this is a 55-year-old with a PhD in engineering from the UK. And he was actually, it was suggested that maybe he should drop his PhD and keep the master's, or maybe drop the master's and just keep his bachelor's. And he didn't, because being the person that he is, he felt that this was just not something that he was comfortable doing. Initially, he didn't, but then he did. He dropped the PhD and left the master's and still was getting rejection letters. So 5 years of rejection, and he was collecting some of these rejection letters. And I can see what it was doing to him emotionally and psychologically. Now, he didn't want to show it to us because, being my dad, he figured that he still needed to provide for his family. And so my dad, with a PhD in civil engineering from the UK, drove a taxi. So he's a taxi driver. And he also delivered fast food to provide for his family. And so these things didn't deter him from doing what he felt was right to do, which is provide for his family. But I can see that it affected him emotionally and psychologically, that this was the first time that people were telling him that what you have isn't something that we need, or isn't, like I said, good enough. And so that was, I was 18 back then. And so that really impacted me. And as I grew older and entered university and completed my PhD in psychology, I created this idea in my head that I needed to find out ways to help people who are visible minorities, marginalized, ethnically and culturally different from mainstream society. Because as a person of that group myself, I realized that there was various forms of discrimination, whether it's age discrimination, which is what ageism is, or racial discrimination, gender discrimination, and the list goes on. And I didn't want them to go through what my family went through.
Mm.
And so, it became my personal mission in university teaching a course on the psychology of aging, where I would provide that ethnically diverse lens to the students who otherwise would have a white Caucasian Western professor talk to them about these things. And I thought that I could provide them with a bit of a diverse lens on that. And so that's been my mission ever since. And I'm very, very grateful and happy to have opportunities to talk about it, like here.
I think that is a really compelling story. Please tell me that things got better. Like, what happened to your
They
dad?
got much better, I have to say.
Okay.
There's a happy ending to this, right? So my dad actually had to leave the country that we immigrated to. So we stayed, which is usually typical with immigrants, right? And I find that, not that we want to digress, but this concept of aging in place, for example, again, is sometimes a bit Western, because it's assuming that people age in the same home that they've been living in for decades. But as an immigrant, where you're packing up your bag and leaving a country every few years, or as a refugee because of displacement, our concept of aging in place is a bit different. It's having a safe place, a place that we can create to become a home. And so my dad left the country. We stayed behind because me and my siblings were at university with my mom living there as well. And he went on to become a dean of engineering in a different country that actually still looked upon older adults in a lens that has more value and more respect. And he retired at the age of 72.
That's a wonderful story. I'm glad things worked out.
Thank you.
If you have you written a book about this?
I haven't, but I have been told.
Yeah, you should. That's the opening chapter. That's a great story. So I think what comes to mind for me when I think about this topic is I think about the human condition. And the human condition is plagued with things that ultimately can hurt society. And one of those is biases, right? We all have biases, whether it's something as silly as I hate mushrooms and I will not eat them. That's a bias I have, to something extreme and negative, such as ageism or racism. I think of all of these things as something that is, and maybe this is my viewpoint about this is wrong, and I'm open to interpretation about how I'm seeing this. But I see this as just something that comes with being a human. And I love it when we are trying to look at these things that make us human and assess what is it about this problem that can lead us towards incorrect decision making from a leadership or even a movement perspective. Major moments in history, I believe, come down to this perspective, how nations grow and change, ranging from atrocities to great triumphs. It's about how we see these problems. When I think of something like ageism, do you see this as something that is inevitable to happen in society? Or is it a matter of perspective? And I guess what I'm trying to ask in general is, how can we view this challenge in the American society in particular? Since I know that's where you did your study and your research. and you have a really unique perspective. So I guess I'm asking, how do we look at this problem?
So going back to, when we were talking about assumptions, right? You look at me, you look at a picture, and you think that I'm the same height as you, for example, right? In psychology, we actually do talk about how we create these preconceived ideas and notions. And usually, even in the hiring process, for example, we find that hiring is riddled with bias because of this innate need for us to include or feel like that we are part of a group of people who look like us, right? So when people hire, for example, they tend to hire people who look like them. And you look at organizations, only after the snazzy, buzzwords of DEI during COVID, when it really started emerging as ageism as well, right? I think COVID provided us with quite a bit of time for reflection and introspection and insight. But you find that even hiring pre this DEI movement was hiring based on, does this person look like me? Would this person fit here? And this is, like you said, this prehistoric disposition of ours to feel like we want to create our group, the us, versus them who do not look like us, right? And they're the ones who we don't include in our group. They're the ones that we do not hire because they don't look like us. They don't identify like us. And when it comes to ageism, the discussion and the conversation, I guess, and the debate is one that almost goes around in circles and circles, right? Which one started first? Why do we have this? Well, again, it could be this innate belief that we have in society that being young, being youthful is associated with power, health, physical attributes that are positive. And therefore, we would like to have people in our group that have those characteristics and traits. And they're the ones that we're going to hire. And so they become ingrained in our belief system in society that people who are younger are more capable. People who are more youthful looking are more healthy, and therefore they will continue working in this position or with us in the organization for longer. And again, we can go into various aspects of the challenges of this, but ageism starts to emerge when there's this belief that we associate abilities, capabilities, strength, prosperity with youthfulness and with younger age categories. And so it becomes hard to shake in a society and shake out of a society. And I said this to a colleague before, when things become embedded in our belief system or in our value system, it's very hard for us to get rid of. Now, you're not born biased. You're not born with these stereotypes, but you are raised, we become, we are brought up in a society that believes in them, and they instill these beliefs in us in direct and indirect ways. Just like we're not born racist, we're not born discriminatory, right? We are raised in a society or in an environment, whether it's family or larger society, and factors that really impact on how we think about a group of people. And like I said, it becomes very hard, and it's not impossible, but it requires, dedication, and it requires us to first and foremost really be acknowledging of the problem. Then we can move forward with trying to find ways to find solutions to them. So it's not that we can't get rid of ageism. It's that it's not as easy as going, oh, I've done a course on psychology of aging, now I'm not ageist. Oh, I heard a podcast about ageism, now I'm not ageist. That's not how it works. But what those things do is it, hopefully, if you're open to it, and now that's another thing, the person has to be willing and open to differences of ideas. If you're open to it, hopefully those conversations help you at least think about this topic in a different way. And maybe that's the first important step to move forward.
Yeah, if we don't talk about it, then it's never going to fix itself.
If we don't acknowledge it, we don't, and it can never fix itself too.
I once heard a comedian, and I'll butcher the joke, so I'm not even going to say it, but the point he was trying to make was it isn't that he was talking about racism, and he was saying that it's not like racism is like cancer. Like you either have it or you don't. Everyone is on a spectrum of biases. And for different things. And some of them fine, some of them not. Some of them can lead to incorrect decision making. And so the context of this conversation is for ageism in the workplace. If we acknowledge that ageism is happening, and I have seen it. So I work with people sometimes over 50, 60, and they feel the weight of that. They feel the pressure of, I have tons of experience and I'm competing with all of these younger people who will take the job for less money, and it's very hard to sell myself. It's almost, there's very few people that I have met in those age brackets that don't tell me that, you know? So it's very much in the context of this discussion of this is a problem on the job seeker side. In terms of the employer side of this conversation, do you think that employers see the benefit of addressing this as a problem? Because from, I would say, my limited knowledge and perspective is that people understand that this is a problem, but there doesn't really seem to be any kind of motivation or energy placed around wanting to solve it. If there is, I'm totally unaware of what people are doing or trying to do in this space. So I'm just curious to gauge like your thermometer of what do companies think about this problem? What are they trying to do in this space?
There are movements. I mean, there are people who are trying to figure out the best way to approach the reality, which is a growing older adult population. And it's a population that is very healthy. I mean, I don't want to generalize, but if we're looking back at the previous, generations and decades, older adults are going to be healthier physically, mentally, cognitively, and are quite capable of providing value to any group or organization. And they are actually tech savvy. I mean, if we're thinking about the boomers right now, they were born and raised during a time where computers existed. The first very computers existed, right? And cell phones existed and technology existed. So it's not like they're completely oblivious to tech and science and advancements. It's a stereotype that we have that, we think that they're not. Many of them are. And again, I don't want to generalize and say everybody is, because there are some form of limitations and disparities in accessing these things. But predominantly, we're looking at a generation who knows and understands and has been using technology. But in addition to that, older adults who are currently, let's say, in their 60s, late 60s, early 70s, like my dad, for example, very capable cognitively, very capable to provide diverse perspectives. And I think a lot of leaders and organizations who they themselves could be of that age category realize the value in an older, chronologically older employee, who could probably provide a wealth of knowledge, mentorship wise, to a younger person or someone who's new to the job, because that person who has been in your company or with your team for 15, 20, 30 years has accumulated the written and unwritten rules of that organization, things that they know the ins and outs, right? And some of these things aren't even on paper. So imagine having that and saying to them, well, you're not good enough anymore because you're too old, right? They're going to take all of that knowledge with them. They're going to be leaving this knowledge gap. I sometimes look at them as knowledge wells. They just have such an abundant amount of information. Now, again, it's very important to recognize, that we don't want to generalize, but there is a realization that the reality is your older adult can provide a lot more value, and it's something that we shouldn't be very quick and rash into getting rid of, or assuming that they're no longer good enough for our environment, and to realize what their capabilities are and how we can still utilize them. And that helps with many things. You're not getting rid of the knowledge base that you have, and you are providing this new person coming in, this younger person sometimes, with access to this knowledge base that they usually wouldn't be able to access. And you're still enhancing and thriving, or creating a thriving environment in your organization. And yeah, I think those realizations are slowly emerging, but like we said at the beginning, you have to be willing to acknowledge that this is an issue and find ways to address it if you want to.
So what's the trigger then for people to see this as a problem that they want to address? Is there something that happens in a company that makes them feel like they need to? Or is this kind of one of those damage control things where, companies slapped with a lawsuit because someone's suing them because of something related to ageism? What's the trigger?
Well, I mean, in certain cases, again, I think if you look at particular organizations that realize, moving, into diversity, let's say, because age diversity and understanding age and how it actually does intersect with this whole DEI movement shed some form of light to the fact that when you have a diverse group in your organization, whether it's diverse racially, gender identity, etc., in addition to age, there is growth and there is power and there is strength. And the hope is that when, as a leader, you are willing to and able to realize that when you have a group who are working with you, your team, whatever it is, that is diverse in their abilities and their backgrounds, and each one brings something unique because of their lens and perspective, that there's only going to be growth and prosperity in that environment. And so the hope is that you realize this as a leader sooner than later. Because really, at the end of the day, if you do get slapped, let's say, with a case, first of all, it might be very hard in some cases to point the finger at an organization and say they laid me off because of age. Because most of these organizations, and we're talking about some of the big ones, they're really good and they've hired a very good legal team. And so even when they're an HR team, and even so when they're laying people off, they're laying them off and wording it in a way that doesn't seem to clarify the reasons, specifically age, right? And so it's very hard sometimes to say, this is why I've been laid off, unless there is some form of documentation or feedback that is written, or verbal and recorded. So it's sometimes hard to prove that, but then it would be too late anyway. Would you really want to go back to working in an organization or with a group of people that didn't value you and respect you anyway? So what's, it's kind of what's the benefit at that point? So yeah, it's like I said, it's the hope is that the more we talk about it and the more we clarify that there is benefit in understanding that this is actually a good thing for you, and this is why it's good for you, and that leaders see the result of that diverse group, then you wouldn't need to be in that situation where people are unhappy and they leave because they don't feel that they're valued. And this goes for any employer. situation.
So for those that may be skeptical, because I think it's fair to say for these kinds of things that yes, ideally these are good things for the workforce. Like I understand the logic behind what you're saying, but do you have maybe some examples of like actual outcomes or benefits that companies receive by not only let's say addressing the bias, but also have like strategies that have helped overcome that in the workplace?
So let's go back to when I said to you, and it's ironic, but going back to when you're hiring people, and you usually tend to find people hire people like them or trust people who look like them.
Mhm.
If you look at organizations, for example, that their clientele base, or they interact with a clientele base that are predominantly a particular cohort or an age group, if you have a staff member that identifies similar to that client, you are more likely to have a client that actually trusts you, whether or not you are from that same cohort. And by that, I mean, for example, if you have a staff member that is of that age category, let's say hypothetically 65 to 70, and your clientele base is that age category, you'll find that clients are more likely to feel confident or comfortable opening up to or trusting a person who they identify with, right?
Mhm.
So this is a kind of a smart social psychology kind of tactic and move. If you are hiring people who are only young, and you think about all of these Silicon Valley tech companies that we will not name, right? Who hire particular age categories, but they are creating software, AI, tech that supposedly are things that older adults would benefit from. There's this gap between what this person thinks that an older person would need and versus what this older person actually does need.
Mm.
And I give you an example of a person that I actually do use in my classes, and her name is Barbara Bestkind. So Barbara Bestkind actually is one of those people who said in her late 80s that she found her dream job, and she worked with a tech company in the States. And that's after she was herself an innovator and a scientist. And that's because the tech company realized that they were creating tools for older adults, but the people creating them were younger people in their early 30s, mid 20s, but they were creating tech and tools for people who were Barbara Bestkind's cohort. And I think she reached out to them, or they reached out to her knowing what she does, and they hired her to actually try out some of these things, and she would give them feedback about what works and what doesn't. And of course, the result was that their numbers were flying out of the roof, because people realized that they had hired somebody who they identify with and who was trying out these gadgets and these things, and they were working because it was created by somebody, or in correspondence with somebody who is that age group. So if anything, that should highlight how it is important for you as an organization to think about this, right? About what is it that I'm going to be losing if I let this person go versus what is it that I could still benefit from. Now, something as simple as that older adult or that person who's in their 60s who has created this rapport and trust with a large client base of yours in an organization. Now, when they leave, they're taking that with them. They're taking that relationship that they have built for decades with them.
Mm.
And that your client now has to create a new relationship with somebody that they don't know. And we know that sometimes it takes a while for businesses and clients to form trust and rapport and a relationship that is beneficial, a reciprocated benefit, right? And so that older person, that employee of yours who you think is no longer good to be around the organization, is going to take that relationship with them, and then you're going to start from scratch again, if you will, right? So I think sometimes just got kind of going back to the drawing board and going, what are the pros and cons if we laid off, asked this person to leave? Sometimes, hopefully, that switch light bulb will go on and go, oh, I don't think that's going to be the right move for us.
In my own industry of pharmacy, this reminds me of empathy, honestly. I know for a fact that many pharmacists tell me that when they experience something in the healthcare system, either a mistake or they get a diagnosis like cancer, there's all of a sudden a newfound appreciation for what their patients are going through. There's a newfound perspective of, I see now and have experienced fully what they are going through. And sometimes it can change entire models from how services are being delivered to even just the short and quick, one-to-one interactions with people. Sometimes it just makes better practitioners. And with the story that you shared, it made me feel like, I see. It's one thing to create something, a product, a service, and deliver it to someone. But when you actually have that kind of person, right, it's kind of like highlighting the value of not support groups. What are they called? Feedback, right? Feedback groups. When you talk to the people that you serve, you gain that inside knowledge. And in the case you shared, right, they hired someone who was their demographic. It's pretty smart. It's brilliant. And in healthcare in particular, overwhelmingly, it is the elderly, right, that experience the healthcare system. And as broken and as beautiful as it can be. So within the context, it sounds like this is really leadership driven. For those that listening, maybe some are leaders, maybe some are not. What steps would you encourage people to take within their own departments to help bring about awareness of this subject?
In healthcare, and I think, you just laid it out so well and beautifully, that you're interacting with people who are really your future selves, right? And I think that's just one of the things that, when we talk about ageism and how we discriminate towards a group of people, in this situation, it's older adults or older people, that's, that's your future self. You are going to be that person. And sometimes I would just ask my students at university who are around 18 to 20, I'd ask them, how would you feel if someone told you that now that you're 70, you're no good to work here, or that you don't belong, or we don't see any value in you, but you still feel like, and you know that you have value to bring? How would you feel? And I think I believe in the larger goodness of people, and I really do believe that just providing them with that moment of reflection gives them that opportunity to go, just like you said right now, oh, I know, I can feel how that feels. But then, you can go beyond that and go, how would you feel if someone did that to your parent? Like my case, it was my dad, right? And I could see his hurt, and I felt hurt for his hurt. And I wouldn't want anyone to do that to my parents anymore. And that's one of the reasons why I'm on this mission, and I'm very passionate about it, because I could see and I sensed that hurt. And I wouldn't want anyone to experience that. And I believe that, even especially in healthcare, you choose that profession because you have empathy. You choose this profession because you do want to help people be better and feel better and live better. And because there is that empathy ingrained in us as people, and especially people who work in healthcare, there is that ability to approach us from an emotional angle and say, reflect on an experience that you had or your parents or your grandparents had, when they were being mistreated because of how old they are, or being devalued because of people assuming that they didn't have the capabilities that they did have, right? And so I think it is of value to provide these compassionate, reflective um, sessions with staff members, and to get them to think about themselves and what they value in life and what they want to do as they grow older. And then think about, if someone took that away from you, how would you feel? And everyone, I will guarantee everyone will say, well, I'm going to be quite miffed because of that, or I'm not going to be very happy with that. And then go, that's the passion. That is what I want you to think of when you are interacting with an older adult. Don't take away their agency, don't take away their competency and their ability to thrive. Because even when you look at, these biases that we carry in the healthcare profession, and I would tell that to my students who are social workers, psychologists, or nurses, I'd remind them and say, if you carry any form of bias, keep in mind that those biases will taint the lens that you'll see your patient or your client with. So try to acknowledge what biases you carry, maybe address them, educate yourself about them, and try to put them aside so you can be your best and do your best for your client.
What a lovely way, I think, to end on this podcast. For people that want to follow you and your work, your message, where should they go, or where can we send them? We'll put links, of course, in the podcast notes.
Yes, thank you. You will definitely find me on LinkedIn. So
That's
LinkedIn
how
is
I found you.
so LinkedIn will probably be the best way to see and read about what I do, what I'm passionate about, and I'd be more than happy to connect with your audience and answer any questions or inquiries that they have.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
That was such a wonderful conversation. Rose was just a delight before and after the podcast. We had some really great discussions about society, culture, we, culture shifts, how we value people, and how that is communicated. And I really appreciated this conversation. It was eye-opening because it even showed within me some biases that have I've seen in the workplace. Um, I'll be honest, when I do get someone who is an older applicant, one of the questions I do ask myself is, okay, well, how long do you want to work for me? I tend to think in those ways. And, it's not wrong to look at your biases and be open with it. I think these discussions, it's so easy to get defensive, to throw your hands up, to say, I'm not ageist, I'm not these things. But we all have our biases. It is a part of our society to assume things about people, to make these conclusions, because we've got lizard brains still in the back of our brainstem that tell us these are the things to be aware of. But what helps us grow and what helps make society better is to really look at these things and ask ourselves, is this helpful? Is this really a true statement? Should we be moving forward in this direction, or is there something else that we could do and be thinking differently to have a better outcome? So I hope that you learned a little bit more on this subject, and I hope that you, like Dr. Rose Judy, are trying to make the world a better place and asking tough questions, whether it's in pharmacy or not. Thank you for listening to this episode, and until we see you in the next one, take care.